based on the results of this referendum, given being the second stage, these regional indigenous nationalities can now go back to the center to renegotiate its federating terms. What NINAS is actually doing is that it wants the indigenous people to get back to recover their sovereignty. And when they recover their sovereignty based on a referendum, they can now determine how they want to renegotiate its terms, how they want to bind back itself, if necessary. It depends on what the people want. The people decide they do not want to continue. They want to have their union on their own. They want to have an independent union. They want to have a confederation or a proper federation. Or they could as well want to come back and say, let us renegotiate how I'm going to be part of this union. So that is the process where NINAS is. And at this point, because the federal government has refused most of these demands, NINAS is at the process of activating the people's power, that is orienting the people to understand that this is the only way forward for us to gain our sovereignty.
Very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in from. It's amazing that we get to look at our numbers, because most times it's in the numbers that you really get to understand what is really going on, especially with Nigeria. And I think the best way to start is to look at what are the dreams of our founding fathers. What did Nigeria used to be in the 1950s before we started to have a situation where the entire productivity of the country, the entire plan basically has been hijacked, and it's currently going upside down. Very common knowledge that we had the poverty capital, one of the poorest countries. I always talk about poverty in the sense that for you to understand the problem of poverty, we have a situation whereby about 90 million people, more than 50% of our population live on less than 1,000 naira a day. And these people are classified as they are living under absolute or abject poverty. So it's a very big problem if you look at it from that regard. And it's 6 million, it's a huge population if you compare with some of the other populations in other countries, right? And even if you compare that particular problem, if you look at it in terms of states, you start to understand it that in the southern part of Nigeria, the poverty, for example, in the southwest, the poverty levels is about 20%. And then if you look at things, take it to the northeast, northwest, the poverty level is about 80%. So it tells you a very big problem that we have in the country. But what sits it even more is that I always ask people that what was the dream of our founding fathers? In the 1950s, Nigeria controlled 49% of the world palm kernel production. Nigeria produced 417 metric tons, ironically, the entire world produced 850,000 metric tons. So Nigeria produced 417,000 metric tons, and those metric tons were produced in the southern part of the country. The palm oil too was produced in the southern part of the country. We produced 42% of the world's production, so 350,000 metric tons compared to 840,000 metric tons produced in the world. Now, if you understand palm oil and palm kernel, they essentially fought the industrial revolution of the 17th, 18th century, and even the 19th century. So without palm oil, you couldn't run your machines. So you needed them to run trade. So it was like controlling the world's crude oil production, essentially. And that was what we were doing back in the 1950s. And the situation got, if you look at the numbers, you can even look at cocoa beans, for instance. Cocoa beans that was predominantly produced in the southwest, Nigeria we produce 22% of the world's production. And similarly for rubber as well, we produce 24% of the world's production. And without rubber, you couldn't do many things, including manufacturing a lot of byproducts for cars, right? And essentially, if you look at the numbers and you put it side by side, if you see the way we controlled the world's economy then and you compare it to now, you see that a lot of things have changed. But despite that, in 1959, a lot of the time, people always say that we used to be a very good country. When we had a little bit of our sovereignty in our hands, you could understand why. Nigeria was growing at 8.4% GDP growth year on year in 1959. If you compare that with last year, we had a minus 0.1%, but aggregate to 0.1% economic growth. So essentially, we contracted the economy. And if you look at it in terms of the structure, which will give you an idea as to what our founding fathers did correctly and what we have successfully done wrong, it might open your eyes into where the whole thing is failing. So essentially, we have in 1959, capital expenditure, which is the money that is provisioned for construction of railway, roads, infrastructure, power, medicine, free education, which is capital expenditure, was classified in the budget, was 58%. So out of 98.9 million budget, 98.9 million pounds budget, 57 million pounds was classified for capital expenditure. If you put that side by side with 2020, we only budgeted 24% of our budget, 2.4 trillion for capital expenditure, which was 24%. Now, if you take that back, recurrent expenditure, which is the money spent servicing salaries, which is the money our founding fathers paid themselves for the job they were doing, they only budgeted 24% of the budget, right? If you put that side by side with 2020, we budgeted 47%. So we essentially spent all that money, 47% of it paying ourselves, and 24% of the money planning for capital expenditure. If you reverse that back into the 1950s, then you can understand the problem. They budgeted as much as 60% of the budget for infrastructure, for capital expenditure. But when it got to our turn to do it correctly, which is the last year, we did it the other way around. We budgeted 47% to pay salaries and 24% for capital infrastructure. So therein lies the problem. And if you compare it by side with all the other deficiencies, if you take that exact amount and you want to value it, if you do the numbers, you crunch numbers, you factor in inflation, what we have essentially done is that our founding fathers budgeted 52 trillion naira for capital expenditure, and we budgeted 2.4 trillion for capital expenditure. So we have reversed the growth. We've spent 60 years just reversing every single growth they've handed to us. Now, if you take that side by side and you now just oppose it with all the other problems that we already know we face, and now we are going to look at, I think everybody is aware of the debt, and it's something that it scares everybody when you look at it and you wonder, how did we get here? So let's just talk about our debt, and I'm going to use just external debt and domestic debt, and I'm going to take just the data so we can see just how quickly we have grown our debt. Let's talk about domestic debt to start. Domestic debt, we had 8.84 trillion. That was in 2015. We started with 8.84 trillion when we handed it over to the Buhari administration. And in 2 years, it had grown domestic debt from 8.84 trillion to 12.59 trillion. So it had managed to borrow 4 trillion more in just 2 years compared to over, I'd say, almost 18 years prior to that. So in just 2 years, he had managed to double our external debt, and that's just in compared to 16 years before him. So these are the paradox of many failures when we talk about the failures of the current administration. If you look at how external debt has also risen in 2 years between 2015 and 2017, they are taking domestic external debt, that's our debt in dollar, from $7 billion to $14 billion. So essentially, it took us 16 years to accrue $7 billion worth of debt. And it took Buhari only 2 years to accrue $7 billion worth of debt. So between 2015 and 2017, he raised external debt from $7 billion to $14 billion. By 2020, external debt had grown from $7 billion where he met it to $28 billion, to $28.57 billion. That is the extent to which we have borrowed our way into this country. And if you look at it, the domestic debt as well, where he met at 8.84 trillion, he has managed to double it to 16.02 trillion. So this shows you clearly that we are borrowing more than ever in our history, more than we've ever had to borrow, more than any administration. If you put the aggregate of 8 years of Obasanjo and 2 years of Yar'Adua and 6 years of Jonathan, that's 16 years. In 16 years, they managed to borrow an aggregate debt, including servicing their loan, clearing up the debt at a stage. All they managed to achieve was $7 billion. Buhari has tripled that to $28 billion. If you look at it from the perspective of domestic debt, all the previous 3 presidents managed to borrow was 8.8 trillion naira. Buhari has managed to borrow in his own administration 16 trillion naira. So he has borrowed an additional 8 trillion. So this tells you clearly that we are heading in the wrong direction. We're not servicing our debts. And even last year, I think we generated about 3.34 trillion in revenue. And then we what do they call it? We generated 3.34 in revenue, and we managed to pay debt servicing of 3.34. So it's almost 98% of our revenue went into debt servicing. Now let's look at it in perspective of who is paying for this debt. Because if you understand this, then you can understand why the alliance territory needs to live as quickly as possible. The first thing we can look at is in 3 different data sets, and we're going to look at the VAT, we're going to look at IGR, it's on another slide, and we're going to look at our GDP. So if we look at the VAT very quickly, VAT generated in between January and August 2021, there was a publication that came out that essentially disclosed the VAT generated by the states. Now, the VAT generated by all the Sharia territory, in total, it's about 51 billion. So it's right here, 51 billion. That's the total VAT generated. The VAT generated by the alliance territory was 731 billion combined. So that's approximately 93%. So the Sharia territory generated 51 billion. The alliance territory generated 731 billion. When it was time for federal allocation, the alliance territory got an additional, they got 235 billion. Don't forget that VAT is essentially whatever you make, you get back. So it's not supposed to be something that is buffed up by the federal government. Essentially, the principles of VAT is that whatever you make, you get it back. So the alliance territory, they generated 731 billion in VAT, and they got 804 billion in VAT, right? Whilst the Sharia territory generated 51 billion in VAT and got 235 billion in VAT. So therein lies the paradox of many failures, where some people are working their hardest, the entire rest of the country, the alliance territory, only got an additional 73 billion in federal allocation from VAT, right? Whilst the Sharia territory got an extra 184 billion in federal allocation from VAT in comparison to what they had generated. That is just horrendous. There's no way that can continue. But of course, we can think that this is an anomaly. This is just one data set, so VAT. Let us take a better look and look at the IGR from 2020, and then that can tell us a little bit more. IGR generated by the Sharia. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Can you help me, please? I'm getting TechnoSpark Go 20. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Go ahead and continue. Please, everyone, mute your lines. Mute your lines. We are live on YouTube, please. So mute your lines and all the avenues as well. So please mute your lines. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
In 2020, and this is where the data gets really interesting. I just showed you right now how much, ripping off happened when it came to the VAT. But let us talk about IGR, and there's a slide for that. I hope I can quickly put it on. If not, we'll just look at it from the slides. Yeah. When we look at the IGR, like I said, the Sharia territory generated 150 billion. The alliance territory generated.
But we are not hearing you again. Hello, Dapo.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you now.
Excellent. Sorry, just a second. I'd like to continue projection. Okay, so essentially, yes, I wanted to continue, but I can't get my screen to go live, so I'll just continue. So from the data 2020,
we're missing your voice again.
Wow. There's something happening with my network.
Yeah, just keep
And
your
I'll come
voice
back.
to where your keep your voice to where your mic is, and then we can hear you, I'm sure.
Okay. Oh, all right. I do apologize. Is it any better now?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll just run through this real quick.
Take your
So,
time. You take your time.
okay. All right. So the Sharia territory now generated 116 billion. The alliance territory generated 1,190 billion. So to put it in perspective, when it came to IGR, the alliance territory generated 91% of the IGR for the country, which is internally generated revenue, which is basically state taxes. And the Sharia territory generated 9% of the revenue. When it came to federal allocation, and this is where you start to notice it, the percentages are very helpful. The alliance territory got 80% of federal allocation, whilst this Sharia territories got 20% of federal allocation. This is a region that only generated 9% of federal allocation. They are getting 20% of federal allocation. They only generated 9% of IGR, they're getting 20% of federal allocation. Whilst the alliance territory that generated 91%.
You need to reposition again.
Whilst, okay. Is it better now?
Yes. So
Okay.
wherever you are, don't move from that position.
Okay, all right. So whilst the alliance territory that generated 91% of federal allocation of internally generated revenue only got 80% of federal allocation. This is a territory that generated 91% of the internally generated revenue. They only got 80% of federal allocation, whilst the other region, the Sharia territory that generated only 9% of internally generated revenue, state taxes, they got 20% of federal revenue. So these are the paradox of many failures. And if you look at it very closely, the fundamentals that guide revenue sharing formula favors the North critically. That's why you never want that constitution to go down, because they are the greatest beneficiaries of the federal allocation of everybody's money. They are the greatest beneficiaries because the principles that guide revenue sharing completely favor them. Things like population, things like land mass, things like even equality as 40%, it completely favors them. So now we've taken a look at the VAT, we've looked at the VAT, we looked at the IGR. We're going to now look at our GDPs. Now, the question people always worry about is when you talk about the alliance territory, always complain that can we cope without this core nut, right? People always say, what about our economy? How is it going to cope? What's the dollar going to look like to the currency in the alliance territory after it balkanizes? Don't take us from frying pan into fire and things like that. Now, hypothetically, assuming that the alliance territory was the country, so I'm just using that for the purpose of this analysis, and the Sharia territory was another country and they split open, what will essentially happen to our GDP is we would go from having an approximately 400 billion economy. So GDP of the core north is 55 billion. Once the GDP of the alliance is 340 billion approximately. So therefore, you would have 14%, you will lose 14% of the economy, the core north, and you will hold 86% of the economy in the alliance territory. So these are the justifications that makes a very strong sense that if you look at the country as a cluster, there's a particular territory that is a dead weight, and that is the Sharia territory. It's literally a dead weight on the rest of the country. If you're able to break that dead weight and lift it economically, you can now start to build a country that will thrive. And if you look at 340 billion in closing, I want to just show you what 340 billion looks like in comparison to other economies. If you look at 340 billion, which is the GDP of the alliance territory, the alliance territory will be between the 36th and 37th country. So that would essentially make us the 36th country, right? Because Denmark will go up to 35, Nigeria will live somewhere around here, Denmark will go up to 35, and then the alliance territory will come down in between Malaysia and Denmark, and before Singapore. So that tells you that, and it is a very close reality to some of the expectations people have of where we should be. In terms of, if you look at that compared to our GDP per capita, it starts to look a bit better. And it gives us a better opportunity to service the debt, service the loans, and all of that. A lot of these unproductive loans that are being taken by the government, they are being invested in failed electricity projects. We read all recently about Siemens complaining about pulling out of the electricity project that they are taking the loan for. Another classic example is the very unproductive railway that Nigeria is currently constructing from Kano to Niger, another country, investing over $400 million of money from the alliance territory into a region that does not generate anything, and investing $1.9 billion of money from that. More than 80% of this money comes from the alliance territory, and then they are going to site it in, more than 91% comes from the alliance territory, and they are going to site it in a region that generates 9%. So these are the paradox of many failures, and these are the justifications why we must come together and repeal that fraudulent 1999 constitution and gain back sovereignty for our people. It's not just about the existential threats, about the killings, even from an economic perspective. It is the only way for us to move forward. We have a situation whereby we are currently existing on the relics of colonialism. We are existing on the relics of extractive institutions. And if you read a book from Daron Acemoglu, it says Why Nations Fail. It will tell you clearly that if you don't build inclusive institutions, you cannot grow your country. And Nigeria, as is made up, is currently filled with extractive institutions domiciled by feudalists and oligarchs from a particular region of the country. The only way for us to break the hegemony is for us to rebuild the 1999 constitution and break free. And then from there, we can start to build a new constitution through referendum, through plebiscites with the alliance territory for an economy that can work like it did in the 1950s. I yield the mic. Thank you very much.
Right. Hello. Thank you so much, Steve, for that information that you've provided.
NINAS, where we came from, where we are, on the road to freedom. Today, we speak of NINAS, but know that the struggle for the restoration of our sovereignty did not start today. As a matter of fact, the struggle started almost as soon as the sovereignty of the ethnic nationalities was stolen by the imposition of the 1999 Constitution, which maintained a unitary government. With the end of the military regime and return to democracy, there was great hope that the country will be returned to what the people had voted for, and that existed prior to the military intervention in 1966. The hope of the country was dashed when, instead of a return to a federal governance structure with multiple self-governing and autonomous government with their own constitutions, the government was kept centralized in a federal government that kept all the power, the assets, and resources of the ethnic nationalities. Making things worse, this so-called constitution was not put to a referendum, and so was not made by the people. Deprive the citizens of their right to benefit contained in Chapter 2, made federal character unenforceable, gave the lion's share of the oil and other assets to the far north through a federal account sharing process that was exclusively weighted to favor the far north and make corruption official. Let me take you back over 2 decades of our journey. It all started when the military regime of General Abdul Salami Abubakar imposed a unitary 1999 constitution, which in turn was a wholesale rival of the 1979 constitution that was also known to be a victory charter for the Nigeria-Biafra War of 1967 to 1970. When it was made public a few weeks after inauguration of General Obasanjo as president, a better half of those in the legal profession gathered itself at conference and, without much ado, recognized the flaws, loopholes, and selfish intentions, then concluded that the constitution was not legitimate and would not lead Nigeria to any form of advancement. It was important that the mechanism or vehicle to set up a countrywide rejection of this forgery of a constitution was put in place. The journey commenced when, in 2004, the Pro-National Conference Organization, PRONACO, was established to revoke the damaged federal constitutional basis of Nigeria. PRONACO being the People's Sovereign National Conference of Ethnic Nationalities in Nigeria, convened in all ethnic nationalities, and quickly mandated its representation to go back to their people and to come up with ratified draft of how they would want to participate in the Union of Nigeria. The conference sat in plenaries across the cities of Lagos, Port Harcourt, Enugu, Jos, and Kano, then returned to Lagos for the final sitting, and in participation, conveners in the likes of Anthony Ehanoro, Wole Soyinka, Chukwu Emeka Odumego Ojukwu, and similar leaders across the territories. This resolution was an agreement derived from the Composite People's Constitution as presented and defended by ethnic nationalities representation in those sequential conferences. And it is important to know that there were observers from the international community, including the US and European Union observers. In August 2006, a delegate from Castina moved the motion for adoption of the draft People's Constitution that emerged from the 29-point resolution of the conference. In furtherance of the PRONACO consensus to restore the federal basis of the Nigerian Union, in 2007, the Movement for a New Nigeria was set up as an enforcement of the consensus at the time to exclude the 12 contiguous northern states that had introduced and embraced the Sharia legal system against the secular basis for Nigeria. The Allies had insisted that democracy and Sharia system could not coexist in the same political space, hence the need for a new vehicle, the Movement for New Nigeria. On the 23rd of May 2007, MMN, through its legal counsel, filed a suit at the Federal High Court Abuja to challenge the legitimacy of the imposed 1999 Constitution, seeking the termination of the entire Constitution. At the court hearings, which had the Attorney General of the Federation representing the federal government, legal representation of the National Assembly, and others admitted the people case which they could not defend the challenge, but insisted that the plaintiff had no locus standi. In English, the plaintiff had no status at law to bring in the case to challenge the legitimacy of the 1999 Constitution. Having acknowledged that the restoration of the people's sovereignty did not need the participation or permission of government, the joint multi-regional vehicle instituted the MMN Lagos Declaration 30th of June 2011, by which the Allies partner blocks, the Lower Niger, South-South, and Southeast, the Yoruba land, and the Middle Belt publicly rejected the Caliphate-imposed 1999 Constitution, mandating regional self-determination actions which included referendum and international outrage. In furtherance to the mandate of the MMN Lagos Declaration, the people of the Lower Niger on the 27th of April 2015 held the Solemn Assembly in Port Harcourt City to wholly repudiate the 1999 Constitution. In that assembly, the 1,885 ethno-linguistic map of the Lower Niger was adopted as a geographical basis of federating. The assembly mandated the distillation of character of relationship as well as asset protection and guarantee scheme to protect the asset of the indigenous people in other blocks of Nigeria. On the mandate for international outrage of the MNN Lagos Declaration, and LNCT visited Capitol Hills, Washington, to make a case for the termination of the operation of Nigeria's 1999 Constitution at the special congressional event on Nigeria in May 2015. The team also made informal consultation for the same matter at the UN headquarters in New York in the same year. 2 years later, still in furtherance to mandate of the MNN Lagos Declaration, the Yoruba indigenous people held the Yoruba Solemn Assembly at Ibadan on the 7th of September 2017. The Assembly publicly repudiated the 1999 Constitution as the basis of the Federation of Nigeria and proclaimed the self-determination right of the Yoruba land to reclaim autonomy of Yoruba land.